Okay. Well, when people talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, the law is usually not the very first thing that comes to mind. But it turns out, despite the fact that the Palestinians are currently pushing the International Criminal Court to investigate Israel, and the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion about the legality of the Israeli wall of separation in 2004, it turns out that the law has actually played a key role in the conflict for the better part of the last 100 years, and no more so than in three largely forgotten but incredibly dramatic trials that happened in the late 1920s and 1930s. You see them listed on the left-hand side. During British rule, during the British Mandate for Palestine. And those three trials, the Shaw, Lofgren, and Peel commissions, involved really what we would consider to be courtroom trials in today's sense of the word. Outside lawyers in two of the three trials, cross-examining witnesses who were testifying under oath, and so forth. And those three trials largely involved two extraordinarily important issues in the conflict that continue resonating to this very day. And you see them there on the right. The first issue, the McMahon-Hussein correspondence and the tension between that correspondence and the Balfour Declaration, basically conflicting British promises of independence to the Jews and the Arabs. I'll talk about that in a minute. And the second issue litigated in these trials involved the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, and the rights and claims of the Muslims and the Jews to the wall. Who owns the Wailing Wall, in essence, was litigated in these three forgotten trials. So let me give you some background about those two issues. The first issue that I mentioned, conflicting British promises during World War I to the Jews and the Arabs that are still argued about to this very day. Here you see a photograph of Sir Henry McMahon. He was Britain's ambassador to Egypt during World War I. And in 1915, the British government was very concerned. They were fighting Germany in Europe. They were fighting against Turkey. Turkey was allied with Germany. Turkey had been the ruling power in the Middle East for the better part of almost 400 years. And the leader of the Arabs in the Middle East under Turkish rule was this man here, the Sharif Hussein, who was based in Mecca. Saudi Arabia nowadays was at that time known as the Hejaz, and it was part of Turkey, part of the Ottoman Empire. And so acting under instructions from London, Sir Henry McMahon reached out to the Sharif Hussein, began a correspondence with him in 1915, in the summer of 1915, the purpose of which, quite simply, was to convince the Arabs to switch sides, to join forces with England, and to rise up against the Turks. By the way, the Sharif Hussein is the great-grandfather of the current king of Jordan, Abdullah II. And so McMahon and Hussein engaged in a correspondence, and the most important letter was written by McMahon to Hussein on October 24, 1915. And essentially, McMahon said, look, I've been authorized by the government in London to promise the Arabs that when the war is over, the Arabs who live currently in the Middle East under Turkish rule will obtain their independence. But there were two exceptions to that promise. The first exception was McMahon saying, I cannot speak for France. France has some interests in the region, and so we're not free to act with any kind of a detriment or a prejudice to French interests. And secondly, McMahon said, and this language has been now argued over endlessly for the last 105 years, McMahon said that certain portions of Syria lying to the west of the towns of Homs, Hama, Aleppo, Damascus, basically starting from here in the north, Aleppo, to Damascus in the south, that certain areas lying to the west of those districts cannot be said to be purely Arab and are therefore not included in the promise of independence to the Arabs. Now, what does the term districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo mean? The word district was not a recognized term under Ottoman administrative law. And the British later argued that what McMahon meant by using the term districts of Damascus was a larger area than just the town of Damascus. What McMahon really meant was the entire Vilayet of Syria, which was all of modern day Syria and all of modern day Western Jordan. And so everything to the west of that would have included all of modern day Israel, Palestine at the time, meaning that none of that area was promised to the Arabs. The Arabs argue, on the other hand, that no. The only thing that was excluded from the pledge was Lebanon, and therefore all of Palestine, modern day Israel, was in fact promised to the Arabs for independence. Well, 2 years and 2 months after this letter, the British government, through its Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, on November 2nd, 1917, issued the famous Balfour Declaration. This time, the British government made a promise to the Jews. And here you see in quotations in the middle of the letter, the famous 67-word Balfour Declaration, in which the British government said they view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Now, this is also ambiguous. What does in Palestine mean? Does it mean all of Palestine? Does it mean part of Palestine? What does the term national home mean? A state or a cultural center? And these words have also been argued about, debated, litigated for the last 103 years since they were written. But essentially what happened was, in the November 1917 letter and the October 1915 letter, Britain made conflicting promises to the Jews and the Arabs of Palestine. And then the League of Nations came along. The Covenant of the League of Nations was incorporated into the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. And here you see two provisions of the covenant. Let's start with Article 22, which promises independence to certain communities formerly belonging to Turkey. And then Article 20, right above it, says that any prior obligations or understandings that are inconsistent with Article 22 are abrogated. So the Arabs have argued ever since then, for the last 100 years, that the Covenant of the League of Nations effectively nullified the Balfour Declaration. Well, also in early 1919, while the Covenant of the League of Nations was being negotiated and agreed upon, here you see Chaim Weizmann on the left, the leader of the Zionist movement based in London. And to his left, on the right side of the picture, is one of the two sons of the Sharif Hussein. This is Faisal, who went on to become the first king of Iraq. And in January of 1919, they signed an agreement. And Faisal said, "We Arabs are sympathetic to Zionism. We welcome the Jews back to Palestine." And in exchange for that, Weizmann pledged scientific and economic support to the Arabs. So the initial Arab reaction to the Balfour Declaration was in fact very favorable. Now, I mentioned, what does Palestine mean? Well, just a year following the Treaty of Versailles, the victorious powers in World War I, England, France, and so forth, gathered together at a conference in San Remo, Italy, and they actually drew the boundaries of Palestine. You see them here on this map. Very interesting to note that Palestine, as of 1920, meant not just modern day Israel, not just the modern day West Bank and Gaza, but all of modern day Jordan. It wasn't until 1923 that Palestine was divided into two parts. One part to the east of the Jordan River became Transjordan, which achieved its independence ultimately in 1947. And the western side, the left-hand side of the map, continued to be known as Palestine after 1923. But originally, Palestine meant the entire area that you see here in white on the map. Well, it wasn't long after Faisal signed that agreement with Weizmann in 1919 that he began to have a change of heart, primarily because he had designs to become the ruler in Syria, but the French had other ideas and kicked him out of Syria in 1920. And by late 1920 and 1921, Faisal and the other Arabs were arguing that the Balfour Declaration was nullified by the Covenant of the League of Nations, and that McMahon had promised Palestine to the Arabs in that 1915 letter. And the British government in 1922 felt compelled to issue this white paper that you see on the left, signed by the then colonial secretary, Winston Churchill. And the white paper says, you see there in the boldface type on the right, that all of Palestine was excluded, was not part of McMahon's pledge of Arab independence. And even more importantly, the second bullet point there on the right, you see Churchill saying that the Jews are in Palestine as of right, not on sufferance, recognizing the historic connection between the Jewish people and Palestine. So that's the background to the first issue about the conflicting promises. Now let me talk about the second issue, the Wailing Wall. Here you see a very famous photograph of General Allenby, British general who had conquered Jerusalem in December of 1917, near the end of World War I. Those of you who have walked through the Jaffa Gate into the Old City will recognize exactly where this photograph was taken. Allenby reading a proclamation in which he made several important statements that I'll come to in a minute. Those important statements were later incorporated into the mandate for Palestine that the League of Nations gave to Britain in 1922. So Britain conquered Palestine in 1917, ruled it militarily until 1922, when the League of Nations formally appointed Britain as the mandatory power, basically the trustee, to rule Palestine from that point forward. And both the Allenby Proclamation on the left and the Palestine Mandate on the right contained an extraordinarily important legal principle that we refer to as the status quo. Both Allenby and the Palestine Mandate said that Britain would continue to honor the religious rights and to protect the holy sites to the same extent that Turkey did under Turkish rule for those several hundred years. And essentially what that meant was that everything the Muslims and Christians and Jews were able to do under Turkish rule, they would continue to be able to do under British rule with no changes to pre-existing rights at the holy places. And that, of course, is very relevant to the Wailing Wall. You see here, this picture is from the cover of my book. It was taken in the late 1920s. You see a group of Orthodox Jews on the left standing at an overlook looking to the Wailing Wall. Notice these structures here between them. These were homes that were constructed, very rudimentary homes, beginning in around the year 1150 AD or BC or CE rather, in the Common Era. These homes were constructed for Moroccan pilgrims to come to pray at the Mosque of Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock on the left. This was known, this area of Moroccan homes, known as the Moghrabi Quarter. After the Six-Day War, Israel took down that Moghrabi Quarter and opened up the area, and this is how it looks today. But back in those days, the area that was available to stand in front of the Wailing Wall was this very narrow strip of pavement that you see in this very rare aerial photograph. Here's another view. You can see on the left this very narrow strip of pavement that people would approach to pray at the wall, and the Moghrabi Quarter on the right-hand side. Well, here's a photograph from 1865 showing Jews praying at the wall. Notice, first of all, men and women standing together, no screen, nothing dividing the men from the women. Also notice how the paving stones have degraded here at the bottom left. It's just an area of dirt, and I'll mention that more in a moment. Here's a photograph from 1910. One of the arguments that the Arabs had made was that during Turkish rule, Jews were not allowed to bring chairs or benches or a Torah to the wall. The Jews later submitted this photograph in evidence in one of the trials to show that, yes, indeed, on certain occasions, the Jews actually did sit on chairs and benches. There was a debate and a dispute as to whether or not the Jews were able to just stand there and pray, as you saw in the prior photograph, or sit on the ground, or in fact, they were able to bring chairs and benches. Also notice this Hebrew writing on some of the lower stones of the wall. That was cleaned off in the 1930s. It had been there for a very long time. Well, on Yom Kippur, of course, Jews would flock to the wall. And in 1928, there was a very serious incident. A visiting delegation of Jews from Poland came for the high holidays, and an Ashkenazi Polish rabbi wanted to put a screen, a mechitzah in Hebrew, to divide the men from the women during the very crowded prayer time during Yom Kippur. Well, the British authorities looked at the status quo provisions in the mandate and in the Allenby Proclamation, and they said to themselves, when the Turks were in charge, the Jews weren't allowed to bring a screen, and the Arabs are complaining that if the Jews bring chairs, if they bring benches, if they bring a screen, the next thing you know, the Jews are going to try to go above the wall and take control of the Temple Mount and rebuild King Solomon's temple. We can't allow that to happen. And so the British government actually, through the Deputy District Commissioner of Jerusalem, Mr. Edward Keith Roach, you see him here standing in front of the Palace Hotel in Jerusalem, Keith Roach ordered the British police to remove that screen, to drag it away. And that was done. And his boss, you see him here, Sir Harry Luke, who was the #2 guy in the British government, the mandatory government in Palestine, he kept a diary. And in his diary, which I found in the archives at St. Anthony's College in Oxford a couple of years ago, Luke wrote about the incident on Yom Kippur 1928, when the British police ordered the screen to be removed. And Luke says that the screen was forcibly removed, which caused a scuffle. One rabbi clung so persistently, he was also removed, adhering to the screen. And you see here in a different color ink, Luke writes, Keith Roach told me nothing more would be heard of it. But that could not have been any further from the truth, because the incident with the removal of the screen on Yom Kippur 1928 provoked a worldwide outcry. The Zionists protested to the League of Nations, and the British government again felt compelled to issue yet another white paper defending the removal of the screen as required by the legal concept of the status quo. But even after that was done, the British government decided that it needed to seek legal advice from its two top law officers, the Attorney General and the Solicitor General, who actually rendered a legal opinion regarding that concept of the status quo and the Wailing Wall. And here you see the actual formal legal opinion on the left. I've excerpted some aspects of it on the right. The law officers found that the Wailing Wall was not purely a Muslim shrine. The Muslims, of course, had always said that when the Prophet Muhammad made his celestial journey from Mecca to Jerusalem, he tethered his horse. The horse's name was Burak. He tethered his horse along the wall, and so the wall became a Muslim sacred shrine. But the law officers said, no, the wall, the only surviving remnant of the ancient Jewish temples, was also a Jewish shrine. But the Jews were trying to encroach on the rights of the legal owners, who were the Muslims, and therefore the Jews would only be allowed to do that which they had done under Turkish times at the wall. And here on the left are the signatures of the Attorney General, Thomas Inskipp, and the Solicitor General of the United Kingdom, Frank Boyd Merriman. Remember his name because I'll come back to him in a minute. Well, after Yom Kippur 1928, both the Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, a notorious figure, as well as the Jews, tried to galvanize sentiment among the Palestinian Arabs and the Palestinian Jews around the Wailing Wall. And the wall in 1929 became a symbol of Palestinian Arab nationalism, as well as Zionist aspirations in Palestine. Tensions increased dramatically during 1929. And on August 15th, Tisha B'Av, remember, we just observed Tisha B'Av, the fast day, the week before last. In 1929, Tisha B'Av was on August the 15th. And on that day, a group of young Jews from the Beitar youth movement went to the wall. They did three things. They made a speech, they unfurled a Star of David flag, and they sang Hatikva, the future national anthem of the state of Israel. The next day, the Mufti organized a counter demonstration, and there was violence in Jerusalem for the rest of that week, culminating in terrible riots on August 23rd. Here you see a very disturbing picture of the riots in Jerusalem on the 23rd of August. And then, of course, the 24th, the horrendous, awful massacre perpetrated by Arabs against Jews in the town of Hebron. The entire Jewish community wiped out. horrible, I mean, just horrible massacre. You see a synagogue in Hebron completely sacked on the left. And now let me take you back to Mr. Luke's diary. He pasted into his diary a clipping from the Times of London from a few days later. This article talks about Luke's visit to Hebron and the terrible, terrible violence that had occurred there. A group of American Jews who were studying in Hebron were slaughtered. But I want to note for you what Luke wrote in handwriting in the lower right-hand corner of his diary page for that day, which is really quite stunning. He writes, "Many Christian houses in Jerusalem and some Jewish ones have painted large crosses on their outer walls." I mean, this evokes memories, of course, of the Haggadah, the Jews marking their doors to avoid the 10th plague. And this just gives you an idea of how utterly terrified the Jewish population of Jerusalem was in late August 1929, so terrified, so fearful for their lives that they resorted to painting crosses on their outer walls. Well, here is the British ambassador to Palestine, the High Commissioner, Sir John Chancellor, pictured with some of his aides. Chancellor had been on home leave in England for the entire summer of 1929. He rushed back after the riots and issued this proclamation, which essentially said that the Arabs were guilty of committing savage murders against the defenseless Jewish population. Well, the Arab population of Palestine did not take kindly to this proclamation. They demanded a judicial proceeding, a trial, because they wanted to show that it was because of the provocations of Zionism, the mass immigration of Jews after World War I, and most importantly, the conflicting British promises, the McMahon Promise in 1915 versus the Balfour Declaration in 1917. The Arabs wanted to show that there were so many grievances within their community, that they had been the victims of so much injustice, that needed to be viewed in the context of what happened in 1929. The Zionists also were pressuring Sir John Chancellor to conduct a trial as well. Chaim Weizmann and the Zionists were fed up with the provocations from the Palestinian Arabs and the Mufti. And so by October, Chancellor was feeling under so much pressure that he wrote in his diary this amazing passage: "Under present conditions, I know of no one who would be a good High Commissioner of Palestine except God." You see it right here on the third line. This diary I found at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, where Chancellor's papers are kept. And a couple of weeks later, Chancellor, still feeling enormous pressure from both the Arabs and the Jews, you see it at the very top here, writes, "I am so tired and so disgusted with this country and everything connected with it that I only want to leave it as soon as can do so without failing in my duty." Imagine, this is the king's representative, the highest British official in Palestine, who only wants to leave as soon as he can do so. Well, a trial was conducted of the Arab riots in Hebron and the violence in Jerusalem. Here you see the judges who were appointed in the middle, Sir Walter Shaw, who had been a fairly obscure British colonial judge, joined by three members of the British Parliament, Betterton, Rhys-Hopkins, and Snell, and assisted by this fellow, Thomas Ingram Lloyd from the Colonial Office. These gentlemen came to Jerusalem and conducted an actual courtroom trial pitting Arabs against Jews, outside lawyers, cross-examination, witnesses, documents, evidence. In the fall of 1929, the Jews were represented by Sir Frank Boyd Merryman, the same Solicitor General who previously wrote that opinion about the Wailing Wall. The British government had changed. The conservatives were out of power. Merryman was available. Chaim Weizmann hired him, paid him an enormous fee of £50,000, and Merryman did an absolutely horrendous job. he was completely outlawyered by this fellow here, Ken Elm Preedy, a British barrister who came to Palestine to be the lawyer for the Palestine government. This is the Solicitor General of Palestine, Sir Robert Drayton. These are the Palestinian police who testified during the trial. And the one who outlawyered Merryman, in addition to Ken Elm Preedy, was this fellow here, Aouni Bey Abdul Khadi, shown a few years later, the most famous Palestinian lawyer of his day. And why did he outlawyer Merryman? Because he was able to convince the judges not just to look at the causes of the riots, but to broaden the inquiry to look at this Palestinian Arab narrative of injustice, of Britain making promises in 1915 that they only retracted on in 1917. And as a result, the lead witness, the star witness for the Arabs, became the Mufti himself, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who testified on direct examination about all of the Arab grievances and tried to justify the riots as something that the Arabs had no choice because of all the provocations from the British and from the Jews. And when Merryman cross-examined the Mufti, all Merryman did was allow the Mufti to continue to tell his side of the story, to continue to spin out the Arab narrative. And here I've pulled a couple of examples of Merryman's cross-examination where he asked the Mufti, do you really think that the Jews intend to take over Al-Aqsa and that they really intend to take over the entire Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, as the Arabs call it? And the Mufti says, yeah, that is my belief. Thank you for asking me those questions. And so when the commission, the judges issued their verdict in 1930, they agreed with the Mufti that the Arab state of mind, that the Arab grievances were in fact one of the reasons for these riots, the fundamental cause. The commission also blamed that Jewish Beitar demonstration on Tisha B'Av as the immediate cause, and the commission exonerated the Mufti for any premeditation. And then finally, the last bullet point at the bottom, the commission rendered a verdict that the Muslims actually own the Wailing Wall because they had conquered Jerusalem in the 12th, actually originally in the 7th century and reconquered it in the 12th century. Well, the lawyer for the Jewish side, Sir Boyd Merryman, went back to England after the trial. He was hoping to become the chief judge, the Lord Chancellor of the British Empire, but they told him, and probably because he had represented the Jews in this trial, they said, sorry, that job's been taken, but we've got a great job for you. You can become the head of the divorce court in London. But a few years later, Sir Boyd Merryman got his revenge because he was the one who signed the final divorce decree for Mrs. Wallace Simpson so that she could marry King Edward VIII, who abdicated the throne. Well, let's go back now to our trials. The next trial occurred in 1930. An international group of judges, a Swedish judge in the middle, Eliel Lofgren, joined by a Swiss judge on the left side of the picture and a Dutch judge on the right. They held a 1-month trial in Jerusalem to determine who owned the Wailing Wall. And here you see the Jewish lawyer, this time not someone from England, but a Jewish lawyer in Jerusalem, Mordechai Eliash, the most famous Palestinian Jewish lawyer of his day. He later became the first Israeli ambassador to England after 1948, but this is now 1930, and he represented the Jewish side in this trial to determine who would own the Wailing Wall. He called a number of witnesses. Remember that picture I showed you of the paving stones and the dirt? Eliash put on testimony, called a witness to testify that the Jews paid in the 1870s to repave the area in front of the wall, that the wall had been desecrated by the Muslims who lived in the area, that the Jews would pay to clean the wall, to keep it in pristine condition. Eliash put on an enormous amount of testimony showing that the wall was sacred to the Jews. And at the end of the trial, Eliash made this very interesting statement in his closing argument. This is the actual transcript. There's only one copy of this transcript in the world. It sits in the archives at King's College in London, where I found it. And Eliash, in his closing argument, says, I have stated that the Jews have not come before the commission to claim any right of ownership to the wall itself. I have underlined it time and again that the sacredness of the wall, the very reverence with which we pronounce its name, the sanctity with which we treat it, prevent us from using the term ownership. In effect, Eliash was arguing that nobody owned the wall, not the Muslims, not the Jews. The wall was not capable of human ownership because it was so sacred and so holy. And so to hold as a matter of law that the Muslims owned the wall and could deny the Jews the right to pray there, which was what the Muslims were claiming, would not have been appropriate. Well, the commission issued a verdict, a formal verdict, in late 1930 that was actually a split verdict. Neither the Muslims nor the Jews were happy. The Jews were not happy because the commission found that the Muslims owned the wall and the pavement, but the commissions also found that that little strip of pavement in front of the wall was not sacred to the Muslims, and therefore the Muslims could not ban the Jews from coming to the pavement to pray at the wall. But the commission said that the status quo principle needed to be observed strictly, meaning that because the Jews were not allowed during Turkish times to bring chairs and benches and screens, they could not do it at the present in 1930 under British rule. The Jews could bring ordinary accoutrements of prayer like a wash basin. They could bring prayer books, but not the Torah. Even on Shabbat, they could not bring the Torah, and they could not bring the shofar or blow the shofar at any time, including Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So both sides were unhappy, but because it was a divided or a split verdict, there was really never much any trouble at the Wailing Wall after 1930 through 1948. Well, the Arabs in 1936 began an uprising against British rule. They were still extremely angry about Jewish immigration. They were angry that the British had not given the Arabs independence as McMahon had promised, or as they claimed McMahon had promised in 1915. And so in 1936, late 36, early 37, the British government sent a royal commission, the so-called Peel Commission. Lord Peel there in the middle was the chair. They were sent to Palestine to do a broad-ranging, searching look at all aspects of Britain's implementation of the mandate, to take testimony from Arab and Jewish witnesses about their claims and their grievances, and to render another verdict. The Peel Commission took hundreds of pages of public testimony and even more, several hundred pages of secret testimony during the trial that they conducted in Palestine in late 1936 and 1937. When the commission returned to London, Winston Churchill testified in secret. His testimony, by the way, was extraordinarily bullish on Zionism. He very much wanted a Jewish state in Palestine. Chaim Weizmann also testified several times before the commission, the most important of which was in early January 1937. You see him here. Some of you may recognize this. This is King David Road in Jerusalem. The King David Hotel on one side, the YMCA on the other side. The YMCA building is where the Peel Commission held its hearings. And Weizmann here getting out of the car to enter the YMCA, where he gave this incredibly important secret testimony. This was where the two-state solution was born. At this moment, one of the commissioners, a professor at Oxford University, Professor Copeland, asks Weizmann, remember this is a secret hearing, Professor Copeland suggests to Weizmann, maybe it would be a good idea to split Palestine into two halves, one Jewish, one Arab. What do you think? And Weizmann, who had no idea this question was coming, he was caught completely off guard, said, permit me not to give a definite answer now. Let me think about it. But as he thought about it a few weeks later, Weizmann sent a letter to Albert Einstein saying, the more I've thought about it, the more I think this is the best answer. A two-state solution. We get our state, the Arabs get their state. This is the best way to go forward. And he said to Einstein in his letter, and I was there at the creation of the idea when Professor Copeland asked me. And so on the left, this was actually the two-state solution the Peel Commission proposed, green for the Jews, orange for the Arabs, And this area in the middle, in red, Britain would continue to keep for itself from the port of Jaffa to Jerusalem. On the right, of course, the map of Israel as it exists today. The Peel Commission also rendered a verdict on that McMahon-Hussein correspondence, finding that McMahon's letter was ambiguous and that it was unfortunate that it could not have been more clear. But McMahon was still alive, and a couple of weeks after the Peel Commission report came out, McMahon sent a letter to the editor of the Times of London in which he said, and you see it on the right, I feel it my duty to state definitely and emphatically that I did not intend to pledge Palestine to the Arabs, and that the Sharif Hussein well understood that I had no intention of pledging Palestine to the Arabs. Look, I'm almost done, but I wanted to just end by saying that with any litigation, with any trial, of course, lawyers always try to settle, the parties always try to settle the litigation. And after the Hebron massacre, actually just in the few days after August 24th, the Hebron massacre, there were 3 attempts very close to each other, 2 by Jews and 1 by an Arab, to settle the dispute over the Wailing Wall. August 26, an Egyptian Jew from Alexandria went to the British Embassy in Paris to try to convince the British government to seize the Mughrabi Quarter. On August 29, 3 days later, Pinchas Rutenberg, the top businessman in Palestine, tried to convince the British government to expropriate the Mughrabi Quarter. And on August 29th, 1929, the Prince of Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, made an extraordinary offer to the British government to sell the Wailing Wall to the Jews. And I'll talk about that more in a second. Here you see the Prince of Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha. He was in line to become the king. His nephew Farouk eventually became king, and he became regent to Farouk. On August 29, 1929, he walked in to the British Embassy in Istanbul, where he was vacationing, presented his calling card to the ambassador, and gave the ambassador this letter, which I found buried in the files of the Colonial Office at the British National Archives a couple of years ago. And in this letter, Muhammad Ali Pasha says to the ambassador, I think that the best way to settle this would be for the Jews to give £100,000 to buy the Wailing Wall, and this would settle the difference. Well, the ambassador in Istanbul forwarded that letter to the Foreign Office in London, and here's his cover letter talking about the offer to buy the wall for £100,000. The Foreign Office put the letter in this file. This is where I found it in London. Here's a handwritten note from the official at the Foreign Office saying it would appear from the last paragraph of the prince's letter that while the Jerusalem Arabs would scorn to sell their honor cheap, they would probably be prepared to do so for £100,000. The letter was filed in the index of the Foreign Office, suggested sale of wall to Jews by Muslims, proposal of Prince Muhammad Ali Pasha. But the British government never told the Jerusalem Arabs about this offer. They feared that it would provoke violence. They were probably right, probably certain that the Mufti, if he had found out about this, would have sent someone to assassinate Muhammad Ali Pasha. That didn't happen. Muhammad Ali Pasha lived for another 20 years, most of which either helping his nephew become king and then moving to Switzerland, where he died. But no one ever knew about this. When I found this correspondence, the letter from Muhammad Ali Pasha, during my research in the UK, I checked with the leading scholars of the Mandate period at the Hebrew University and Tel Aviv University. They were quite stunned, quite shocked to see this. It's the first and only offer in the history of the conflict by an Arab to sell the Wailing Wall to the Jews. Okay, I think I've talked long enough. I'll end there. This is the cover of my book. It came out a few weeks ago. I would be more than happy to take any questions or comments. Thank you very much for your attention. And Cindy, thank you again. And to the federations in Ventura, Peoria, and Springfield for inviting me to share some of this with you today. Thank you so much. Cindy, I think you're muted. I can't hear you.
Cindy, you're press the unmute. You need. I think I can unmute her. There.
Thank you. The host had muted me. Thank you. I wasn't able to unmute. Okay, Caleb, you want to fix it so the screen, so you're not showing on the screen, but I am?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Wow, that was absolutely fascinating. So just a little housekeeping. In the center of your screen at the bottom, there's at the very right is a little Q&A box that you can ask questions for Steve. If you'd like to put those questions in the box, Steve and I will have a conversation. So please ask your questions there. So I'm going to ask the first question, Steve.
Sure.
Fascinating. I just can imagine when you found some of these letters, the elation that you felt in the research process. So can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to write this book and about the process for researching it? Because documents there that are just incredible, and photographs. I'd love to hear about your process.
So what inspired me to write the book, thank you for the question, by the way. I had always been interested in the conflict, wanted to, as part of my sort of second career here as a professor, wanted to write something of a very, very academic and scholarly nature. And in doing my research of the existing literature, realized that although there have been millions of books written about the conflict, and quite a few books written by Palestinian legal scholars and Israeli legal scholars about the question of who owns the West Bank or who has sovereignty over the West Bank, no one really has looked at how the Jews and the Arabs began using the law as a tool, a resource, a weapon to gain leverage against each other, to influence international opinion, going back 90, 100 years. Even during Ottoman times, it turns out, Jews and Arabs were sending legal petitions to the Sultan in Constantinople, Istanbul, making legal arguments against each other. And that, to me, was so fascinating because, as I said, many of those legal arguments continue to resonate today. When we hear or read what the Palestinians especially are saying today, from a legal perspective, you can draw a direct line back to the arguments that their lawyers were making and their witnesses were making in the 1920s and 30s. As far as the research was concerned, I knew right away that I would need to do a lot of research in Britain because Britain was the mandatory power. And many of the documents, the relevant documents, are stored not just at the National Archives in London, but throughout various other archives in the UK. And I spent a long time, many trips, at least 7, 8 trips, going back and forth to the UK to find those documents in those archives. A lot of it is detective work. There's almost nothing has been digitized. And so it's really a matter of going through the indices, pulling files. Many of the files are mislabeled. The letter I mentioned from Muhammad Ali Pasha offering to sell the Wailing Wall was buried in a file labeled Colonial Office Correspondence for 1929. There would be no way of knowing, not even the word Palestine was on the cover of that file folder. So it's really a matter of just trial and error, hunting through archives, going page by page, looking for material. Same story in Israel, the Israeli National Archives, the Zionist Archives, the Weizmann Archives. It's a very long process, but very, very rewarding to find interesting information.
Fascinating, just fascinating. We do have a question in the chat from Jonathan Gartner. So it's a long one, Steve, so I'm going to read it to you. The UK Foreign Office has long been viewed as a bastion of Arabists. It appears that the FO sat on the Egyptian prince's offer to sell the Wailing Wall for GBP 100,000. Do you have any further color on who made the decision to sit on the information? Did any heads roll because of that? Did this fact play any role in the negotiations to wind down the British mandate 2 decades later? So that's a lot in one. I can take it in pieces, or if you've got it, we're good. All right.
Thank you, Jonathan, so much. Nice to hear from you. I guess I'll go in reverse order. No, the letter played no role in the dissolution of the mandate whatsoever. The letter really was consigned to the dustbin of the Foreign Office, initially by the recipient of the letter, Sir George Clerk, the British ambassador to Turkey, who received the letter from Muhammad Ali Pasha, could have done two things. He could have forwarded the letter to his colleague, Sir John Chancellor, I mentioned him earlier, the British ambassador or the British High Commissioner in Palestine, and could have said to Chancellor, here's a very interesting creative proposal from a very brave Egyptian prince. Treat it with all confidence, because if the word gets out, the Mufti will try to kill him. But maybe you can do something to quietly bring this to fruition and achieve a settlement. That was one option. The other option, which is the option that Clerk chose, was to send the letter instead directly to London to the Foreign Secretary, Arthur Henderson, where it was received by that clerk who made that handwritten comment. There was some other commentary in the file that I didn't talk about, where the low-ranking officials kind of go back and forth writing minutes and notes on the file saying, should we let the Arabs know about this? Should we just forget about it? Should we just bury this? And the decision is made unanimously at the sort of bureaucratic level in the Foreign Office to bury the letter, not to disclose it to the Arabs, because the British were worried about more violence. And I think that that fear was very, very well founded. Unfortunately, Muhammad Ali Pasha never followed up, never tried to contact Weizmann, never tried to contact any of the leading Zionists. The one thing that to me is a lingering mystery is that within 3 days of each other, two Egyptians, one a Jew from Alexandria, Menasseh, who I mentioned earlier, walked into the British embassy in Paris, gave the British ambassador a letter urging the British to basically take over the Maghrebi quarter and then sell it to the Jews. 3 days later, another prominent Egyptian, Muhammad Ali Pasha, walks into another British embassy in another part of Europe, Istanbul, and gives the British ambassador there a different letter proposing a sale of the wall to the Jews. Is it possible that these two famous Egyptians, Menasseh and Ali Pasha, were coordinating their efforts? One said, I'll go to Paris. The other said, I'll go to Istanbul. We'll make these secret overtures to the British and see what happens. I found no evidence that they were in contact, but to me, it's really maybe more than a coincidence that within 3 days of each other, these two Egyptians walked into two different British embassies in Europe with two different offers about the wall.
Interesting. Thank you. We have another question from Bob Rothenberg. He's asking, what is the reaction of the British, the Palestinian, and the Israeli governments to the revelations in your book?
Thanks, Bob. So I did a presentation like this, like the one we're doing right now, a few weeks ago that UCLA put together. We had 450 people from around the world, including many from the Palestine government, the PA, the Palestinian Authority, and from the Israeli government. And the Q&A was really interesting at the end, because that was where I began to get a sense of how both sides were reacting to my book. And interestingly enough, both sides were sort of taking from my presentation, and some of the people who actually read the book, they were kind of cherry picking bits and pieces that supported their narrative. And I was very careful in this book not to issue my own verdict as to who was right and who was wrong. I was much more interested in writing about how both sides have used the law, not just in the last 20 years, but going back a century. I'm now working on my next book, where I'm going to take the narrative about the legal aspects of the conflict into the 1940s, which is an extraordinarily important decade, obviously, for both the Holocaust as well as the founding of the State of Israel. And at the end of that book, the last chapter, I am now going to render my own verdict. And just a sneak preview, I'm going to argue in this book that as a matter of law, Israel's claim to sovereignty is superior to the Palestinian claim to sovereignty over the West Bank,
Mhm.
As a matter of politics, that doesn't mean that annexation is a good idea or a bad idea, and it may very well be a horrible idea politically. But legally, I'm going to show that the Israeli claim of sovereignty over the West Bank is far superior to the Palestinian claim.
Fabulous. That's
So the
fabulous.
reactions, Bob, will probably be different at that point.
Well, it's interesting because what makes the conflict go on is that everybody cherry picks the different
Right.
points of view. Do you have any aspirations that you might solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian conflict, or
Well,
with this?
lawyers are not going to solve this conflict. We're not going to litigate our way to peace.
Okay.
And that becomes especially clear in the next book, where I'm going to write about 3 more trials. And if you look at all 6 trials, the only one that really helped to bring a measure of calm was that second trial I spoke of today, the Lofgren Commission, which gave this split verdict about the Wailing Wall, leaving both sides unhappy and both sides kind of grudgingly accepting that they had to just sort of move on. And there really was no more violence at the wall for the next 18 years during the remainder of the mandate period. So maybe we can use the law to address some minor discrete issues in the conflict. Not that I'm trying to denigrate the status of the wall at all,
Mhm.
but maybe the law can play a role, but not for the broader conflict. The law will not be a good tool to use to resolve the Palestinian refugee issue or the final status of Jerusalem or that sort of thing. That has to be done by diplomats. The lawyers can then kind of paper over the treaties and the contracts that flow from the diplomatic negotiations.
Wow.